Okay, so it is now showing as recording. And like I said, if there's anything, thank you, Margaret, anything that you want to ask or say off recording, we're absolutely happy to stop, but you can also use the Miro board and that can be completely anonymous. So, difficult conversations. They can range, there's a whole, gamut of difficult conversations that you can have, but it's often an uncomfortable topic. But something that we need to acknowledge. But before we get into that, really important that we acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we all stand. So we gratefully acknowledge them and their custodianship of the lands on which this project originated, this country known as Australia, where Aboriginal people have lived and practiced their culture for many thousands of years. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So objectives for today, like I said, we're going to move through this really quickly. The first thing we're actually going to do is set a social contract for the workshop, but that is also an opportunity to think about if you're not already using a social contract or actively using a team charter, how that can give you a consistent understanding of the expectations around behaviour. So it's very useful, but it's something that you have to use actively. How to identify a difficult conversation so that you don't just suddenly end up in one. Explore what might be in the way and the impacts of not having it. Looking at the difference between tension and conflict and some of the factors that can actually contribute to these conversations. And then we'll lay the foundations to understanding some of the key elements. It's really important to understand that these conversations are typically about you and what you bring into them. They're not necessarily about your team. It's really around your mindset and the way that you set yourself up for success, that you practice and build the skills. So the social contract, we're going to switch over to Miro for a second. So if you think about what you need to create a safe space so that you feel like you can contribute, you can be upfront and open, what do you need and how are you going to contribute to creating a space like that for other people? So if we take a look at Miro, give me a second. I can see there's a couple of people in here. We've got a space here. And we've got some tickets or post-it notes on the left-hand side. So you can drag over. What are the things? You can also add post-it notes. You can see them on the right-hand side. What are the things that help you to feel comfortable in a situation? It can be things that you need to have or things that you need to avoid, for example. So if you're trying to have an important conversation with someone and they're off video, that's obviously much harder. It's actually probably better to be on the phone. But there are other situations where, somebody's not feeling well, and it's a group situation, obviously that's fine. So for today, some of the things that we will do, we'll use thumbs up and thumbs down, which helps us to keep moving quite quickly. You can ask questions anonymously through Miro. If your internet drops out, that's fine. Just jump back in. And I can't give you what happens in the session stays in the session unless you ask for us to stop recording, because we are recording this both for our own feedback and so we can see what works, what doesn't work, and also for some people who can't make it today. So this is not part of the social contract today, but typically in a difficult conversation, it absolutely would be. We're also going to ask you to add questions to Miro. It's further down on the section. And you can, we've got here, Margaret, did you want to talk to this one? I think it was a great addition.
So the dropout if I'm bored, that is actually hopefully not for today, but it is a conversation in the future that if you've set up the social contract with the team, if somebody isn't engaged, let's have that conversation and let that be part of how you then contract to make sure that that is effective for everybody involved. So it was added here more as a thought provoker than for today's session, but to try and show you how the social contract can be used for yourself and the teams around you.
Thanks, Margaret. Is there anything that anybody wants to add? You've got post-it notes over on the right-hand side, things that come to mind when you think about what makes it a safe space for you. You can also jump off mute and just say it if you want to. I can see people moving around. The last two I'll pull in. So as you know, if you can keep your video on, it contributes to the energy in the session. Alternatively, you can take your mute off and you can converse with us. Multitasking is an interesting one in a big group session. It's really common to multitask. It's really important to be aware of how that will impact the value of what you are taking out of a session and what you are contributing. So it's really easy to then get lost in what you're doing elsewhere and to not pick up the insights and nuggets and things that are going to be valuable for you. I'll point out there's a link down the bottom of the slide here so you can learn more about social contracts. Typically, you would take a bit of time to create these. This will give you a little bit more detail on what to look at. And it's actually something that if you do create this with your team, and you really do need to create it as a group, you're creating that common shared understanding of how we're going to interact, and you're giving people ownership and accountability to hold each other to that. And that is actually a really great way to start to set up a bit more of a safe space. So conscious of time, we're going to jump back into our slides. I'm going to give you one more chance. Is there any questions before we move on that?
So is it like everyone has to agree on this as well? Like there could be something which has been added by one person but may not be agreed by someone else. What do you do in that case?
Then you need to have a conversation around that. So part of setting the social contract, and this is why it can take 45 minutes or an hour, or you might actually do like a short session. Everyone gets to add, you come together and you go, I don't want to say that we always have to have the video on because, like I just don't feel well on some days, but I'm fine to actually, and that is one that I've seen that can be really, really contentious.
Yes.
Walking during meetings, so like a big group meeting where it's like the CEO updating 10,000 staff, like a lot of those in my team were like, right, you can go out and go for a walk. All you need to do is listen. You don't need to be able to see the screen. So it's really actually getting into some of those details around how you interact. But yeah, that's the conversation you need to have, and that helps to reduce the assumptions and the I'm offended because you did this or whatever it is. Bringing all of that out.
Yeah.
Good question. So, jumping back, I'm going to hand over to Margaret.
Thank you, Amber. And that was a great question on the social contract, because it is a concept that when you start using it can really help you in the space of difficult conversations. For the purpose of our workshop, we are using the definition from the Fair Work Ombudsman, where a difficult conversation is defined as one in which you have to manage emotions and information in a sensitive way within the workplace. And this can take many different forms, but think about a time when you've maybe had to manage difficult tension or conflict within your own team, or poor performance or behavior. You've maybe had to deliver difficult messaging from the organization, or a job applicant that wasn't successful. So there's so many different scenarios within which this definition falls. Some may be familiar to you, you may be aware of others, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's what we need to be really mindful of, is that your skills and what you bring to that situation are what is going to determine the success and the outcome of that. As Amber said, often these conversations are more about you than the other person, because it's how you engage in that space. So we are going to jump back into Miro and use a little bit of an interactive session. Have a bit of a brainstorm. We'll take a few minutes just to capture what has stopped you personally having a difficult conversation. Anything that comes to mind, put that in there, because this is a really great thought provoker when we get to the next exercise. So yeah, jump into the Miro board. You can see there's some space for you. Just capture on the post-it notes what has stopped you having a difficult conversation, or somebody else that you've noticed. I'm just checking that everybody can actually access the board. Yes, I'm really great. Okay, just a couple more minutes while we capture the last bits there. Okay, anything else? Going once, going twice. Okay, thank you. I see we've also had a drop off because not feeling 100%, so yeah. So thank you. And you can see there that we have a number of different reasons that people have not had difficult conversations, and there's common themes that you will see pop up. But I want you to have a think about what is it that sits behind you not having that difficult conversation. Could it be a previous experience where you've had a difficult conversation, it hasn't gone well, and so you're now more apprehensive moving forward? Could it be the fact that you don't quite like conflict and tension? And we know that that can make somebody vulnerable. And vulnerability then means we may choose the path of least resistance, so we avoid. I saw a great one captured there, which actually underpins so much of it: fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of how that person's going to respond, fear if they're going to judge me or what they might say. So we know that the reasons we avoid are very personal to us, but there are some common themes and trends. And it's really important next time you find yourself resisting that difficult conversation or being hesitant, ask yourself, what is stopping me from having it? What do I need to address before I can be more comfortable to move into that space? The question we often say is, what is that story I'm telling myself? I don't have the confidence, I don't have the skill set. How do you test to see if that's true? So really some great ideas, some great reasons, as I said, personal to everybody, but think about what your own story is and what's stopping you. We know there's that snowball effect. What is the risk of not taking action? It's lower morale, less engagement, higher turnover, greater absenteeism, ultimately more conflict within your team. For example, if you're not managing underperformance, it can damage productivity. Is it actually giving that team member or that person an opportunity to improve their performance? But one of the biggest risks of not taking action is, think about that weight on your own shoulder that you carry around knowing, I've got to have it, I've got to have it. And every day that goes by, that's burden that sits on you. And that is a big risk, because what is the damage that does to you? So think about next time you stop, what is that risk of not taking action? I am going to touch briefly before I hand back to Amber on tension versus conflict. And we talked about, often it is that tension conflict space where we feel vulnerable and we will seek to avoid it. But as a leader in an organization, every team you have, there is going to be, and there needs to be, a degree of tension. It's healthy, it keeps things dynamic, it keeps innovation, and it keeps the team actually moving in the right direction. Conflict in its true nature is very rare, but tension is really normal, and there's a sliding scale. And as a leader, it's down to you to navigate where in that scale you are and where you need to be. So it is a little bit of a moving piece, but it's being able to step into that, knowing that you do have the skills and techniques, and it's a very normal space to be in. And often we find it's addressing things early, it's being open, and there's some skills that we'll give you at the end of this in terms of, if you use those, how it becomes easier to navigate that space. But really importantly is, you bring a lens and somebody else brings a lens and perspective. And it's important that you understand what's going on for them. So I'm going to hand back to Amber as she delves into those more individual elements.
Thank you, Margaret. So when we think about tension and conflict, there are actually 6 factors that are very common across a lot of different people. So this is based on more than 40 years of research. And each factor is going to be more or less important for different people. What we see, justice, for example, it looks like justice is actually typically more important if you're more junior. And as you get more senior and you have more influence over what the processes are, you're not as concerned about it. So it's actually something to keep in mind as you move, if you're moving into more senior roles. And justice is like transparency, how a process is applied, are they consistent? Autonomy is a huge one. How can you structure your day? Can you make decisions without interference? Recognition is nearly always important. It can be very, very important or just important, but it's pretty rare that somebody doesn't want to be recognized for their effort or expertise. Social support. Do you have interaction? Can you offer help? Can you ask for help? Stability and structure. So how much are things changing and how do you deal with that change? Do you need structure or are you happy to kind of fly by the seat of your pants? And how much challenge do you need or want in your role? So it's really important to think about how important are these for you, but if you're working with other people, and particularly if you're leading a team, do those people skew in a particular way? And if you know, for example, you've got lots of change coming up, then you can actually look at other factors that you can impact to try and balance that out somewhat. For example, more social support or more autonomy if you know there's lots of change coming through. These are really good things to think about too. Like if there's tension, maybe some of that tension has been created by something that's happened in one of these factors. So there's a link on this, you'll have access to it to actually see a little bit more around those factors. And if you do have questions, feel free to come off mute and just ask them. So why are we talking about burnout in this? So those factors can actually contribute either to motivation and resilience, or they can also contribute to burnout. And if someone is coming closer and closer to burnout, then it's actually much harder to make conscious decisions to really contribute in the way that you would want to. And unfortunately, burnout is incredibly common at the moment, or at least a level of risk. So 77% of people experiencing burnout at their current job is massive. And these stats are all after COVID. It's actually still very, very high. People managers are also much more likely to be burnt out. You know, you're trying to manage your team, but you're also trying to manage across your level and then up. And professionals really don't feel that their employers generally are doing enough to prevent or alleviate burnout. There's a lot of great work around resilience programs and self-care, but if the environment that you're in is actually contributing to your burnout, then those things are only going to work in the short term. So worth considering this. There are some aspects you can potentially pick up on. And what we found, there's a university in Belgium that created a new assessment in 2020, and it built on the previous assessment, which was actually over 40 years old. So these 4 aspects are typically what you're going to see, and there's a link within this, which you'll have access to, it describes them. But apart from exhaustion, which everyone knows about, what you'll see, mental distancing is when you don't care, like you withdraw, you might not be having as much contact with your team. And it's just really hard to actually care about what you're doing when you really used to. There might be a level of cynicism. Cognitive impairment is struggling to concentrate, to remember things, to make decisions. And emotional impairment is when, you don't typically lash out or burst into tears, but you're actually finding it much, much harder to manage your emotions. And what we tend to see is that people in professional desk jobs are seeing more cognitive impairment. And then if you're in a caring role, maybe as a nurse or something like that, it's more likely you're going to have emotional impairment. So they're good things to understand and be aware of in your team. And there's also things that you can do based on those. If you're going into a difficult conversation, you may be dealing with some elements of this, given how common burnout is at the moment. So I'm going to hand back to Margaret to talk through some of the actual skills that you can look to develop as you're going into these conversations.
Thank you. So we said at the beginning, this is about you and how you prepare and what you bring to that conversation. So controlling the elements that are within your sphere. 5 key skills that we see going into having these difficult conversations. The first being active listening. So being fully present, being aware of your body language and the other person's body language. Giving time and space. So being okay with silence, which I know often people like to fill. So it's okay. Often that will allow other things to come up and be said. Seeking to understand rather than to reply. And that means suspending your own stories at time, and we'll come on to that in a bit more. Emotional intelligence. So when we look at the above the iceberg and below the iceberg, there are elements of these skills that sit above, below, and in both. The active listening is tapping into often what sits above. But if you do it really well, you get to what sits below. The emotional intelligence is what is going on for you before you even enter that conversation. Have you had a bad morning? A bad start to your morning is now the right time to actually be having that conversation. And as much as you've got stuff going on, the other person will too. So how do you, again, make the time and space, that silence potentially, and you listen to what's not being said and you tap into what's going on for them? Checking your headspace before you engage is just absolutely paramount, and maybe choosing not to have that conversation because your headspace isn't where it needs to be. Authenticity. This is, as it says on the box, being genuinely yourself. But when you bring yourself to that conversation and you are real, it builds the trust. It also allows that person to feel safe. Something that is a little bit harder is suspending judgment or that preconceived idea. You think you're going into that meeting or that conversation and you know the outcome, but you can't really know the outcome until you've had that conversation. So suspend that judgment and that story that you're telling yourself. The fourth of these skills is validation. So allowing the person to be heard. Don't feel you need to rush to a solution. Allow the emotions to come up, allow them to tell their story, acknowledge their experience. It's theirs, it's not yours. There is not every conversation has to lead to a solution, and the solution doesn't have to come till much, much later in the conversation if it comes. So just validate their experience. Communication. I know this seems a little bit counterintuitive because we say it is a skill when you have a conversation, but communication is both what you say, what you don't say, and it's also being conscious of the words that you use. So non-judgmental language, open-ended questions, not asking a question with an intention behind it other than to seek to understand. And with communication, it's always better to go in as early as possible, so don't allow that snowball effect, and to be as transparent as possible. So we think that when you apply these 5 skills, you are going to have better outcomes. But my question is, which of these skills do you currently have? If you have them, are they strengths? Where are the gaps for you? And even when you have things that you think are strengths, how do you know that they're landing in that conversation? How do you know that they are working for you? And one of the big premises of why we do these workshops is in the later workshops, allowing role play, allowing feedback, allowing you to have a safe space to let others give you, oh, that didn't land very well. That actually felt very comfortable, because until you get to practice your skills, you're not really sure how they're landing. So I would leave you with that question of, where are your gaps and are you really honing your strengths? Remembering that there's no one size fits all approach. So actually, before I jump and hand over to Amber, I'm going to ask if there's any questions.
No questions yet, but I think these are very valid key skills which you have mentioned. And probably what I was thinking is if you go to the third point, it's like it says, the second point. So if you are not in that space, what do you do at that time? But you have to go and talk to someone.
Really great question. And if delaying that conversation isn't a possibility, then what can you do to get in the right space? Is there somebody that you can go and talk to just to debrief or vent before you go into it? Do you need to do some breathing exercises? Do you need to go for a walk outside just to get yourself in that space? So think about what it is. Awareness and recognizing that you're not there is absolutely paramount. And then what will help you get there?
Mm. Depending on the conversation, some of the conversations it will be not appropriate at all. You may be able to share with the other person what's actually going on for you.
Right.
So
yeah, because sometimes you don't even get it. Like I have been in situations in which I have come from a meeting and I have to go for another meeting, and the previous meeting has spoiled it so much, and then it's become very difficult to have that other conversation in the next meeting.
yeah, I think that's a situation where it depends on the relationship you have with the people in the next meeting. Can you just be a few minutes late and even go into the bathroom and just do some breathing exercises? Or is it, you know, if you're meeting a new person, just like you've got to judge obviously the situation, but there may be times when you can actually share that with the person, and that little bit of vulnerability and reminder that you're human can build the relationship. But there are also obviously times you don't share it. And the example that comes to mind for me is a Silicon Valley head of a tech startup who fired a whole lot of people over video and was talking about how hard it was for him to do that with the people he fired. Obviously, in that situation, you're not sharing your own personal emotional state. But, you know, if you've had a really challenging meeting and you're going into another meeting with people you know well, there's a good chance that you can actually share that or just ask for a few minutes before you start.
Perfect. Yeah, being authentic over there will help.
Yeah. It's a hard judgment call.
Yeah, and that being authentic with yourself too. You know, you also have needs, and being authentic with somebody else, but then what do you need in that moment as well?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Amber, over to you.
Thanks, Margaret. So next steps, and we do have a couple of minutes actually. So we'll wrap up. We've got 2 slides, and then we can have a bit of conversation. We'll stop the recording. So yeah, role plays and practice. There is opportunity to do that with us. You can also obviously set up to do it with other people that you know. And it is really one of those situations where you need to practice to build the skill, and it becomes more comfortable and you understand what works for you. For me, if I'm really nervous about something, I need to move, I need to stand up, and that helps me to actually get the energy out. So can I go for a walk with someone rather than sitting in a meeting room, for example? Testing approaches and responses with different people and getting that feedback. So, you know, how can you get feedback, particularly objective feedback? That will really help you to get confidence on what's happening for the other person as you have that conversation. And this really helps you to lay the foundations to understanding, where is your mindset at? What are you bringing into that? How can you leave behind the elements that are distracting you or concerning you and really be focused in the moment? What's the context for the other person? And you really need to be present if you're going to try and understand that, because people are not obviously always going to tell you all of the details of what's going on for them. And then really getting to the root cause of the problem, not just the surface level where you're not necessarily actually going to make any progress.